The fluorescent lights in the shelter's cramped room hummed their monotonous tune as Sarah Mitchell methodically folded Emma's clothes. Tiny pink shirts, small purple pants, a sundress with cartoon butterflies that her daughter loved. Her hands moved mechanically, almost as if they belonged to someone else, someone who wasn't falling apart from the inside out. The small room, barely larger than a closet, smelled of industrial detergent and something else, desperation, perhaps, or the lingering scent of fear that seemed to permeate every corner of the women's shelter on Maple Street. Sarah was 34 years old, though she looked older. 7 years of marriage to Mitchell had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with time. Her once vibrant brown eyes, which her college roommates had called warm and inviting, now held a haunted quality that no amount of sleep could fix. She'd stopped wearing makeup months ago. What was the point? Said makeup made her look like a cheap whore, and she'd learned that agreement was safer than resistance. Her light brown hair, which she kept in a perpetual bun now, had started graying at the temples. She was only 34, but some mornings when she caught her reflection in the mirror, she didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. 3-year-old Emma sat quietly on the narrow bed, clutching her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Floppy, she called him, watching her mother pack with the solemn expression of a child who had seen too much. Emma was small for her age, delicate-featured, with her mother's brown eyes and her father's dark hair. She'd been born into a marriage that had seemed perfect on the surface. Had been charming then, attentive, the kind of man who brought flowers and whispered sweet promises about their future together. Nobody had warned Sarah about the subtle shift that came after the wedding, the way love could curdle into possession, the way words could become weapons, and how quickly physical affection could transform into something dangerous and terrifying. The breaking point had come last Tuesday night. Sarah hadn't done anything particularly wrong, at least, nothing that would justify what happened. She'd burned the pasta, a simple mistake, one that any home cook might make, but had come home stressed from work, and the pasta incident had become the focal point for all his frustrations. He'd thrown the plate against the wall, the ceramic shattering into dozens of pieces. Then he'd grabbed her by the throat, not hard enough to leave immediate marks, but hard enough that she couldn't breathe, hard enough that she saw stars dancing in her vision. Emma had screamed from the living room, and Sarah's mother's instinct had her fear. She twisted free and pulled her daughter close, locking them in the bathroom for hours while raged outside the door. That night, after had fallen into a drunken sleep, Sarah had made the decision that would change everything. She'd called her sister, packed a bag in darkness, and with trembling hands, she'd driven to the women's shelter with Emma crying softly in the back seat. That was 3 months ago. 3 months of living in this small room. 3 months of restraining orders and legal consultations. 3 months of trying to convince Emma that none of this was her fault, that Mommy was protecting her, that things would get better. But things had gotten worse. His family was wealthy and well-connected. His father was a retired judge, and his uncle owned one of the largest law firms in the state. They'd hired the best lawyers money could buy, and they were determined to paint Sarah as a vindictive, lying ex-wife who was trying to turn their grandson against his father. They'd minimized his history of violence, suggesting that Sarah had provoked him, that she was dramatic, unstable, manipulative. In their version of events was the victim, a devoted father being kept from his child by a scorned woman. The incident that led to Sarah's arrest had occurred 4 weeks ago, had somehow discovered their location. Sarah suspected a private investigator, and he'd shown up at the shelter one evening. The security guard had been distracted and had walked right through the front door, up the stairs, and burst into Sarah's room. Emma had been sleeping, and Sarah's scream had awakened her. What followed was a blur of terror and adrenaline. Had grabbed Sarah's arm, demanding that she come home with him, that she stop poisoning Emma against him. Sarah had tried to push past him, and in the struggle had lost his balance. He'd fallen backward, his head striking the edge of the heavy oak table with a sickening crack. The ambulance had arrived within minutes. had been taken to the hospital with a serious concussion, a fractured skull, and bleeding in his brain. Sarah had been arrested at the scene and taken to jail, despite the shelter staff's desperate pleas to the police about his history of domestic violence. The prosecutor had listened politely to their accounts, taken their statements, and then proceeded with charges against Sarah anyway. Self-defense cases were complicated, the prosecutor had explained. It would come down to what a jury believed. Now sitting in the jail cell awaiting trial, Sarah faced an impossible reality. If she was convicted and given the prosecutor's aggressive stance, it seemed likely she would go to prison. Emma would enter the foster care system. Once released from the hospital, would pursue custody. Everything she'd fought for, every sacrifice she'd made to protect her daughter, would be for nothing. Worse than nothing. Emma would be placed with the very man Sarah had been trying to shield her from. The court date was scheduled for November 15th, 3 weeks away. Sarah had spent countless hours with her court-appointed attorney, who seemed competent but overwhelmed. The prosecutor's case was straightforward. Sarah had committed assault. Her motivation didn't matter. Her fear didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that she'd used force against, and he was in the hospital as a result. Had asked about Emma several times. Can she testify? Can she tell the court what she witnessed? But Emma wouldn't speak. The child psychologist had confirmed what Sarah already knew. Emma had developed selective mutism, a psychological condition where children stop speaking due to extreme anxiety or trauma. She could speak, theoretically, but the fear had silenced her voice as effectively as any gag. Sarah stared at the prison ceiling in her small cell, listening to the sounds of other women crying, fighting, desperate. She wondered if this was how her story would end, not with safety or freedom, but in a prison cell, separated from the daughter she'd given everything to protect. She thought about Emma's drawings, dark, angry scribbles that the psychologist said indicated deep psychological distress. She thought about Emma's nightmares, her refusal to eat, her withdrawn expression. The breaking point had shattered more than just the skull. It had shattered Sarah's life into 1,000 pieces, and she had no idea how to put them back together. All she could do was hold on, hope that could work miracles, and pray that somehow justice would prevail. But as she lay in the darkness, Sarah's hope felt like a fragile thing, easily broken, like everything else in her life. Doctor sat across from in the small clinical office of Riverside Children's Mental Health Center, her expression grave and concerned. The psychologist had been working with Emma for 6 weeks now, and the prognosis she was delivering was exactly what had feared to hear. Emma Mitchell, 3 years old, exhibited all the classic symptoms of selective mutism, a rare childhood anxiety disorder where a child becomes psychologically unable to speak in certain situations, despite having the ability to do so. She speaks at night, doctor explained, adjusting her glasses. The shelter workers report that Emma talks in her sleep, sometimes crying out, sometimes calling for her mother. She has vivid nightmares, but during waking hours in the presence of anyone other than Sarah, she's completely silent. It's a psychological defense mechanism. Her mind has essentially decided that speaking is dangerous. Listened intently, taking notes, her mind racing with the implications. Without Emma's testimony, the case against Sarah was strong. The prosecutor would argue that Sarah had overreacted, that she could have simply left the room, called security, anything other than pushing a man hard enough to fracture his skull. Emma's voice, a 3-year-old's innocent account of what she'd witnessed, could have changed everything. But that voice seemed to be locked away behind walls so thick that no key yet existed to unlock them. Back at the shelter on Maple Street, Emma sat on the worn gray carpet in the activity room, surrounded by coloring supplies and toys. The room was designed to be cheerful, bright primary colors on the walls, posters of smiling cartoon characters, shelves overflowing with books and puzzles. But Emma's presence seemed to drain the cheerfulness from it. She sat motionless, her small frame rigid, her expression blank. In her hand was a red crayon, which she used to make violent, aggressive marks on the white paper in front of her. The drawing depicted 2 stick figures. The larger one had an angry red scribble for a face and arms raised in what could only be interpreted as an aggressive posture. The smaller figure, presumably Emma, was drawn far away, disconnected, without facial features. Between them was a blur of red lines like flames or chaos. The art therapist sat beside Emma but didn't speak. She'd learned that talking didn't help. Emma couldn't, or wouldn't, respond. Had worked with traumatized children for 15 years, and she'd seen selective mutism before. But Emma's case was particularly severe. Most children with the condition would at least nod or shake their head, could communicate through gestures or pointing. Emma did none of these things. She simply retreated into herself, becoming a ghost in her own body. The only indication that she understood what people were saying came through her eyes, a slight flicker of acknowledgement, then the shutters would close again. The shelter's director, Ms. Rachel Williams, had documented everything meticulously. She understood that this documentation might be crucial for the trial. She noted when Emma ate minimally, what she ate, mostly soft foods, as if chewing was too much effort, when she slept fitfully, with frequent nightmares, and when she engaged with other children, never. Emma was present in the shelter but absent from life. Sarah was allowed supervised visits with her daughter for 2 hours each day. These visits broke both their hearts. Sarah would arrive eager to see Emma, desperate to connect with her only child, and Emma would sit beside her mother with the emotional affect of a statue. Sarah would talk, telling Emma about the books she was reading, the songs she was humming, the future she was planning for them, and Emma would stare at nothing, occasionally reaching out to touch her mother's hand as if needing reassurance that Sarah was real, that she was still there. One afternoon, Sarah brought a new stuffed animal, a soft yellow duck, hoping to spark some reaction from Emma. Emma had looked at it with her hollow eyes, then turned away. Sarah felt the rejection like a physical blow. Her daughter was slipping away and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She sat in her cell that night and wept, imagining Emma growing up like this, silent, traumatized, broken by the violence she'd witnessed. Visited the shelter twice a week, trying different approaches to reach Emma. She brought picture books, hoping Emma might point to images. She brought a keyboard, thinking maybe music could unlock something in the child's psyche. She brought toys, games, anything that might create a bridge between Emma's internal world and the external one. Nothing worked. Emma remained locked in her silence, impenetrable as a fortress. The legal landscape was shifting in ways that terrified. Lawyers had filed a motion to have the assault charges elevated, arguing that the severity of his injuries, the fractured skull, the bleeding in the brain, indicated that Sarah had used excessive force. They were pushing for felony charges now, which meant prison time measured in years, not months. The prosecutor's office seemed sympathetic to this argument. "We have a problem," told Sarah during their lawyer-client visit at the jail. "The evidence without Emma is weak. Family has money, connections, and a narrative. They're painting you as a scorned woman who attacked an innocent man. Your defense of 'I was protecting myself and my daughter' sounds hollow without witnesses." "What about the shelter staff?" Sarah asked desperately. "They saw the bruises on me. They saw break in." "They did," agreed. "And their testimony will be helpful. But the prosecution will argue that those bruises could have come from anywhere, that you're a troubled woman with a mental health history." "I don't have a mental health history," Sarah interrupted. "I know that, you know that. But in court, a good prosecutor can plant seeds of doubt. Without Emma, without a child's innocent voice saying, 'Daddy hurt Mommy, I was scared,' we're fighting an uphill battle." Spent sleepless nights researching options. Could they find other witnesses? Emma's teachers had reported signs of abuse, behavioral changes, drawings, statements Emma had made before she stopped speaking. But statements made by a now-mute child before the trauma worsened might not be admissible in court. Could they use expert testimony about selective mutism itself to explain why Emma couldn't testify? Perhaps, but that wouldn't give the jury the emotional impact they needed. The trial date loomed closer, now just 2 weeks away. Emma remained silent. Sarah remained imprisoned, and remained desperate, packing her office at midnight, searching for some mechanism, some key, some way to unlock the voice of a traumatized 3-year-old who held her mother's freedom in her silence. In her small room at the shelter, Emma drew another picture. This one showed a small figure sitting alone, surrounded by darkness with nothing but emptiness all around. There was no mother in this picture, no protection, no safety. There was only a child alone, screaming silently into the void, sat alone in her office at 11:47 p.m., surrounded by scattered papers, cold coffee, and the weight of responsibility that felt heavier with each passing day. The city streets below were quiet, most people long since home with their families, safe in the knowledge that their worlds were stable, had no such comfort. She had a 3-year-old who wouldn't speak, a mother facing prison, and a legal system that seemed stacked against her client in every conceivable way. She'd been researching for 6 hours straight, moving from case law to psychological journals to obscure academic papers about trauma and recovery. Her eyes felt gritty, her neck ached, and her mind was beginning to feel like it was moving through mud. But somewhere in her desperation, she'd stumbled onto something that made her pause, a series of articles about therapy animals and their role in helping trauma victims communicate. The first article she read was from the Journal of Therapeutic Jurisprudence. It discussed a case in Ohio where a therapy dog had been present during a child witness's testimony about abuse. The dog's presence had reportedly calmed the child enough that they were able to communicate details they'd been unable to share before. His heart had started racing as she read further. There were more cases. Research studies showing the neurological impacts of petting dogs, decreased cortisol levels, increased oxytocin, a measurable decrease in anxiety responses. She then discovered research from the University of Arizona demonstrating that children with anxiety disorders showed significant improvement in symptoms when given access to therapy dogs. One study specifically mentioned selective mutism. A small sample size, admittedly, but the results were striking. One child who hadn't spoken in 14 months had begun communicating within weeks of therapy dog integration. His fingers flew across her keyboard, searching for more information. That's when she found the profile. Officer James, County Police Department, handler of Buddy, a 5-year-old golden retriever certified in multiple therapeutic and assistance categories. The photo showed a calm, professional-looking man with kind eyes and an extraordinarily beautiful dog. The dog's credentials were impressive: certified for crisis intervention, trained in de-escalation techniques, experienced in courtroom settings. Had brought Buddy to several court cases to help anxious witnesses, with reportedly excellent results. Read the testimonies of witnesses who'd been helped by Buddy's presence. A woman testifying about sexual assault who'd finally been able to speak about her trauma. A teenage boy witnessing his father's crime. A young girl describing abuse. In every case, Buddy had been present, calm, non-reactive, a silent anchor in a storm of emotional chaos. And in every case, the witness had been able to communicate. A wild idea began forming in its mind. It was unconventional. It was risky. It might be seen as manipulation of the jury, but it might also be the only thing that could save Sarah's life and keep Emma with her mother. She spent the next 3 days preparing her motion. She researched precedent cases, compiled scientific studies, drafted legal arguments about the admissibility of therapy animals in courtroom settings. She consulted with other attorneys who'd successfully argued for animal assistance in court. She documented Emma's condition, the psychological barriers to her speech, and the theoretical basis for why Buddy's presence might help. The motion she drafted was 17 pages long, meticulously footnoted, professionally argued, but essentially asking for something the court system had rarely, if ever, granted: to bring an animal into the courtroom during testimony from a traumatized child. Scheduled a meeting with officer before filing the motion. She needed to know if he was willing, if Buddy was truly trained for something this unprecedented, if the risks were acceptable. His office was in a modern police facility on the east side of town. When walked in, she found to be exactly as his photo suggested: calm, professional, genuinely caring about the mission he and Buddy served. "I've seen a lot of traumatized kids," told her, his hand resting gently on Buddy's head. The dog sat perfectly still, his amber eyes focused and alert. "Never in a courtroom setting, but the principle is the same. Animals don't judge. They don't have agendas. They just offer presence and acceptance. If a kid is locked up by trauma, sometimes an animal can be the key that unlocks them." "Would you be willing to testify about Buddy's qualifications?" asked. "And would you be willing to bring him into the courtroom if the judge allows it?" Didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. This kid needs a voice. If Buddy can help her find it, we're in." Felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. She filed the motion on a Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon, she'd received the prosecutor's response. It was scathing. District Attorney Richard argued that bringing a dog into the courtroom was a carnival act masquerading as evidence, that it was prejudicial manipulation designed to appeal to jurors' emotions rather than present facts, that it violated the integrity of the judicial process, and that it set a dangerous precedent for future cases. "If we allow therapy dogs," wrote, "what's next? Clowns to cheer up witnesses, therapy cats. The courtroom is a place of law, not a petting zoo." Read his response and felt her fragile hope begin to crumble. He was right, in a way. It was unusual. It was outside the normal parameters of courtroom procedure. She'd be asking a judge to take an enormous risk on something that might be seen as frivolous or manipulative. Judge was assigned to the case, a woman in her late 60s with a reputation for being fair but strict. Had appeared before her twice before, both times successfully, but this motion was different. This wasn't a request for a continuance or a procedural adjustment. This was asking the court to fundamentally change how they approached testimony from traumatized children. Requested a hearing on the motion. She spent 2 days preparing her oral arguments, practicing her presentation, anticipating every possible objection the prosecutor might raise. She gathered her research, printed the studies, prepared exhibits showing Buddy's credentials and training. The hearing took place on a cold October morning in Judge's chambers. Presented her case, citing research, precedent, and the dire circumstances facing Emma Mitchell. Argued passionately against the motion, calling it an emotional manipulation that had no place in a court of law. The judge sat back in her chair, silent, thoughtful. Held her breath. This was it. This was the moment that would determine whether Sarah's daughter would find her voice or remain locked in silence forever. Everything depended on whether one judge would be willing to take an unconventional gamble on the power of an animal to unlock a traumatized child's ability to communicate. Judge removed her reading glasses and rubbed her eyes. "I have," she said quietly. "I've read the research on trauma and animals. I've also read the prosecutor's arguments." She paused, seeming to weigh something internally. "I'm going to grant this motion, but under strict conditions. The dog remains neutral. No tricks. No coaching. If at any point I believe the animal is being used to manipulate or prejudice the jury, it's gone immediately. Is that understood?" Felt tears spring to her eyes. "Yes, Your Honor, absolutely." She left the courthouse in a daze. They had their chance. Now they just had to pray that it would be enough. The morning of November 15th dawned gray and cold, the kind of day that seemed to match the weight pressing down on everyone involved in Sarah Mitchell's case. Arrived at the courthouse at 6:45 a.m., 2 hours before proceedings would begin. She needed time to center herself, to prepare mentally for what was about to happen. The unconventional strategy she'd fought so hard to get approved would either save her client or destroy her credibility as an attorney. There was no middle ground. The courthouse hallways were already beginning to fill. News of the case had spread through the media like wildfire over the past week. A 3-year-old girl who wouldn't speak, a mother accused of assault, a therapy dog in a courtroom. It was the kind of human interest story that news outlets couldn't resist. Cameras had been set up outside the building before dawn. Reporters stood with their microphones, waiting to ambush anyone connected to the case with breathless questions. "Ms., do you think the dog will help?" one reporter called out. "Are you manipulating the jury?" another shouted. Ignored them all and pushed through the courthouse doors, her briefcase clutched firmly in her hand. Inside, the hallways were cooler, quieter, but no less chaotic. The courthouse was a place where fates were decided, where lives were irrevocably altered by the decisions of 12 strangers and the judgment of a man in a black robe. Officer James arrived at 8:30 a.m. with Buddy. Had requested that they come early so Emma could see them before the courtroom chaos began. They met in a quiet witness room, Buddy, and then Sarah, who was brought from the holding area in her orange prison jumpsuit, her hands trembling with anticipation and dread. When Sarah saw Buddy, something shifted in her expression. The dog was magnificent, a perfect golden retriever with kind eyes and a calm demeanor that seemed to settle everyone in the room. Officer walked Buddy forward slowly, allowing Sarah to pet the dog's head. "This is Buddy," said softly. "He's going to help Emma today. He understands his job. He's done this before." "Will it work?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, fragile as tissue paper. "We're going to find out together," replied. At 9:00 a.m., the courtroom doors opened. The gallery filled quickly with journalists, court observers, curious citizens, and court staff. The benches were packed shoulder to shoulder, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that was almost palpable. Judge entered and took her seat, her expression unreadable. District Attorney Richard sat at his table, his expression tight with disapproval of what was about to transpire. Took her place at the defense table, her heart hammering against her ribs. The jury had been selected and sworn in the week before, 12 men and women who would determine Sarah's fate. They looked calm, professional, neutral, wondered what they were thinking about the unconventional strategy they were about to witness. Some of them probably thought it was absurd, others might be sympathetic. There was no way to know. Then Emma was brought into the courtroom. The little girl looked impossibly small in the big room. She wore a pale pink dress that Sarah's sister had brought to the shelter, a dress Emma loved, with small embroidered flowers on the sleeves. Emma's small hand was held by a court advocate, a woman trained to help child witnesses through the testimony process. Emma's eyes were wide, taking in the enormity of the space, the rows of people, the gravity of what was happening. When Emma saw the courtroom, her breathing became shallow and rapid. She stopped walking, her small body tensing. The court advocate gently encouraged her forward, and Emma moved like a person in a dream, present but disconnected, going through motions without really understanding them. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on her mother for a brief moment before looking away. Sarah's face crumpled with emotion. She mouthed the words, "It's okay, baby." But Emma's expression didn't change. The court clerk administered the oath in a modified form for a 3-year-old. "Do you promise to tell the truth?" Emma didn't respond verbally, but she nodded slightly. That was enough. Stood and approached Emma slowly, her voice carefully modulated to be gentle but clear. "Emma, can you tell us your name?" Emma's lips moved, but no sound came out. "Emma, can you say your name for us?" Nothing. Stomach clenched. This was already failing. She pressed forward with her prepared questions, each one met with silence. Emma stared at her hands, at her lap, at anything but space. Minutes ticked by. The courtroom was utterly silent but could feel the jury's skepticism growing. This was a disaster. The child wouldn't speak. This unconventional gamble was about to blow up in her face. Then Officer entered with Buddy. The dog walked calmly to the witness area, his movements deliberate and professional. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Buddy wore his official vest, identifying him as a certified service animal. He walked directly to the area near Emma's chair and, without any apparent command, gently lay down beside the little girl, his head positioned so that it was accessible to her if she wanted to reach out. Emma's eyes flicked down to the dog. For a moment, just a moment, something changed in her expression, a spark of something, interest, recognition, hope. Judge leaned forward from her bench, her expression intense. "Proceed carefully, Ms.," she warned. Knelt down beside Emma, bringing herself to the child's eye level. She spoke softly, almost whispering. "Emma, can you see Buddy? Isn't he pretty?" Emma's eyes remained fixed on the dog, but she didn't respond. Felt desperation beginning to claw at her chest. The strategy wasn't working. They'd come all this way, fought all these battles, and it was still failing. "Emma," said, her voice steady despite the panic inside her, "do you think Buddy would like to hear your story?" The question hung in the air. It was unconventional, unprofessional perhaps, but it was last attempt to reach through the wall of trauma that was keeping this child silent. Emma's small hand slowly reached out. Her fingers, trembling slightly, made contact with Buddy's soft golden fur. The dog didn't move, didn't react, just remained perfectly still, a silent anchor in Emma's sea of terror. And then, in a voice so quiet that the courtroom had to strain to hear it, Emma whispered her first words in months. "Daddy was scary." The courtroom gasped collectively. It was the sound of hope breaking through impossibility, of a voice that everyone had believed was lost suddenly returning from the depths of silence. Her eyes filled with tears, but she pressed forward, her voice steady. "Can you tell Buddy more about what happened?" Emma looked at the dog, her hand still resting on his fur, and began to speak. The moment Emma's voice emerged from the silence, 3 whispered words that seemed to reverberate through the entire courtroom like a church bell, felt something shift in the universe. This was the sound of justice breaking through impossibility. This was hope made audible. She took a breath, steadied herself, and spoke in the gentlest voice she could manage. "Tell us what happened, Emma. Tell Buddy about your daddy." Emma's small fingers continued to stroke Buddy's golden fur in slow, repetitive motions. The dog remained absolutely still, his breathing steady and calm, his entire being focused on providing comfort to this traumatized child. It was as if Buddy understood that this was the most important moment of his life, that a little girl's future depended on his steadfast presence and his refusal to flinch or judge. "Daddy was scary," Emma repeated, her voice gaining slightly more strength. She was looking at Buddy, not at the jury, not at anyone in the courtroom. She was speaking to the one being who didn't threaten her, the one presence that was purely accepting and non-judgmental. He yelled, really loud. He made scary sounds. His heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone in the courtroom must be able to hear it. She forced herself to speak slowly, to ask open-ended questions that would allow Emma to continue without leading her toward any particular answer. The rules of evidence were strict about children's testimony, couldn't put words in Emma's mouth. "What happened when your daddy yelled?" asked softly. Emma's hand trembled slightly as she petted Buddy. Her eyes, which had been fixed on the dog, briefly flicked toward her mother. When she saw Sarah, tears began to well up in the little girl's eyes, but she didn't stop speaking. Her voice became smaller, more fragile, but more determined. "Mommy said no," she said, "no, don't. And Daddy got really angry. He was so angry, Buddy. His face got all red and he made mean sounds." Emma paused, seeming to gather courage. "He hurt Mommy." In the gallery, Sarah made a small sound, something between a sob and a gasp. Her hands covered her mouth, glanced at the jury and saw that every single face was focused intently on Emma, most with expressions of deep compassion and concern. "How did your daddy hurt your mommy?" asked, maintaining her gentle tone. "He grabbed her arm, really hard. He grabbed and pulled." Emma demonstrated with her own small arm, pulling at the air in front of her. "Mommy screamed. She screamed really loud and scared, and I got scared too." The child's breathing was becoming more rapid now, as the memories poured out like water from a broken dam. Buddy shifted slightly, pressing his body against Emma's leg, and the contact seemed to ground her, to remind her that she was safe now, that she was in the presence of love and protection. "What did you do when your mommy screamed?" asked. "I cried. I was so scared, Buddy." Emma's voice cracked with emotion. Mommy said go hide and I went to hide in the closet. It was dark and I didn't like it, but Mommy said I had to stay there. The child wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing tears across her small face. I could still hear Daddy being mean. I could hear him yelling and yelling. I was scared he would hurt Mommy forever. I was scared he would hurt me. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the journalist had stopped fidgeting. Even District Attorney sat motionless, his expression unreadable but his face slightly pale. Proceeded carefully, not wanting to traumatize the child further but knowing that the jury needed to understand the full scope of what Emma had witnessed. When you came out of the closet, what did you see? Emma was quiet for a long moment. Her hand continued its rhythmic stroking of Buddy's fur, the motion seeming to both calm her and give her courage. When she spoke again, her words came out in a rush, as if the floodgates had truly opened and everything that had been up inside her was now rushing free. Mommy was on the ground. She was scared and she was crying. Her arm looked funny and she said it hurt really bad. Daddy was still being mean. He was standing over her and he was still yelling. He was saying mean things like you can't take Emma from me and you're a bad mommy and you ruined everything. Emma's mimicry of voice was chilling, filled with a rage and intensity that no 3-year-old should have to replicate. I was so scared, Buddy. I didn't know what to do. I just stood there and I was scared and scared and scared. Sarah's entire body was shaking in the gallery, her sister's arm around her the only thing keeping her from collapsing completely. What happened next? Asked, her voice thick with emotion. Mommy picked me up. She was hurt, but she picked me up anyway. She held me really tight and she said, "It's okay, baby, Mommy's got you. We're going to be safe." And she ran. She ran really fast to the bathroom and she locked the door and we sat in there and I cried and cried and cried. Emma's own crying was escalating now, her small body shaking with the release of months of suppressed trauma. We sat in the bathroom for a long, long time. Daddy was outside yelling and banging on the door and he scared me so much. I thought he was going to come through the door and hurt us again. Buddy, sensing Emma's escalating distress, shifted his entire body to lean against the child's side. The golden retriever's weight was grounding, his presence a solid reminder that the danger had passed, that this little girl was no longer alone in that bathroom, terrified and helpless. Emma wrapped her small arms around Buddy's neck, burying her face in his fur. Allowed the moment to stretch, giving Emma time to collect herself. She looked at the jury, and every single face was streaked with tears. One juror, an older woman in the front row, was openly weeping, her hand pressed to her chest as if physically holding her heart together. Another man stared at Emma with an expression of profound sadness and protective fury. "Emma," said quietly, "did your mommy do anything wrong when she was protecting you from your daddy?" Emma looked up from Buddy's fur, her small face blotchy from crying, her eyes red-rimmed but clearer than they'd been in months. "No," she said simply. "Mommy saved me. Mommy protected me. Daddy was trying to hurt us and Mommy stopped him. Mommy is the brave one. Mommy is my hero." The courtroom erupted. Some jurors were openly sobbing now. The judge had to call for order, her own voice wavering slightly as she did so. Felt her own tears flowing freely now. She'd fought so hard for this moment, had gambled everything on the possibility that a traumatized child could find her voice with the right support, and she'd been right. Emma had spoken. A 3-year-old's innocent, heartbreaking testimony had cut through all the legal arguments, all the prosecutorial posturing, and revealed the truth with a clarity that no expert witness could have achieved. Buddy remained steadfast against Emma's side, his presence a testament to the healing power of unconditional love and acceptance. Judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack, commanding order in a courtroom that had descended into barely controlled chaos. Journalists were frantically typing into their phones. Court observers were leaning forward in their seats, whispering urgently to one another. The bailiff stood alert, though there was no real threat. What had occurred was not violence but the opposite, a moment of such profound truth that the room itself seemed to be reeling from the impact. Emma remained curled against Buddy, her small body still trembling from the emotional earthquake of speaking about her trauma. Officer stood nearby, alert and ready to comfort the dog if needed, though Buddy seemed to understand instinctively that Emma needed him more than anything else in this moment. The connection between the child and the animal had transcended the mechanical. It had become something spiritual, something that everyone in the courtroom could feel. Stood carefully, giving Emma a moment to regain her composure. She could feel every eye in the jury box on her client's small daughter. She could read the transformation that had occurred in their expressions. The skepticism was gone. The doubt had evaporated. What remained was something far more powerful: empathy, rage on Emma's behalf, protective fury toward a child who had been forced to endure unconscionable trauma. Sarah sat in her seat at the defense table, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Her sister squeezed her shoulder from the gallery behind her, and even through her overwhelming emotion, Sarah felt a small spark of hope ignite in her chest. They had done it. Emma had found her voice. The truth had finally been spoken. District Attorney Richard sat motionless at his table, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck were visibly tense. He knew what had just happened. Everyone in the courtroom knew. A 3-year-old child had just systematically dismantled his entire case with nothing but the simple, devastating truth. But was a professional, a veteran prosecutor who had handled difficult situations before. He rose slowly from his seat, adjusted his tie, and approached Emma for cross-examination. This was the moment that could either solidify Emma's testimony or undermine it. A skilled cross-examiner could twist words, create confusion, plant seeds of doubt. Had that skill. But he also had a conscience, and as he looked at this small, traumatized child sitting against a therapy dog, something in his expression shifted. Watched him carefully, knowing that his next move would be crucial. Emma began, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "I have a few questions for you." Emma didn't respond verbally, but she looked up from Buddy's fur, her tear-stained face showing the exhaustion of speaking about something so painful. "How old are you?" Emma asked. 3, Emma whispered. "That's right, you're 3 years old. Do you know what it means to tell the truth?" Emma nodded slowly. "It's when you say what really happened." Paused. He could have gone after her, could have suggested that her memories were confused or that she'd been coached. Instead, he did something that shocked everyone in the courtroom. He asked a few more straightforward questions, clarifying details that Emma had already provided, allowing her to reinforce her testimony rather than attack it. He realized, allowing justice to take its course. After just 5 minutes, returned to his seat without further questioning. The spectacle had feared, a prosecutor viciously cross-examining a 3-year-old trauma victim, never materialized. Knew when he was beaten. More importantly, he knew that attempting to discredit a child who had just described genuine abuse would be repugnant to every person in that courtroom. Rose to redirect her questioning, but she kept it brief. Emma had said what needed to be said. Prolonging her testimony would only cause additional trauma. "Emma, thank you for being so brave," said softly. "You can go sit with your mommy now." A court advocate gently helped Emma to her feet. The little girl wrapped her arms around Buddy one final time, burying her face in the dog's fur and whispering something, inaudible to everyone but the dog, before allowing herself to be led toward her mother. When Sarah saw her daughter approaching, she stood up, breaking protocol, and pulled Emma into her arms. For a moment, the courtroom was no longer a place of legal procedure and professional distance. It was simply a mother and daughter reunited, Emma finally safe in her mother's embrace. Judge didn't reprimand Sarah for standing. No one did. Everyone understood that the rules of courtroom decorum had been suspended in the face of something more important: the protection of a child and the vindication of a mother's desperate love. The jury's faces told the entire story. The woman in the front row, who had been weeping throughout Emma's testimony, sat with her hand over her heart, her expression fierce and protective. The older man next to her had his jaw set, his eyes burning with righteous anger at what had been done to that child. A younger juror in the back row was openly crying, making no attempt to hide her tears. The shift had been complete and irreversible. Sarah Mitchell was no longer a criminal defendant in their eyes. She was a mother who had done what any parent would do: protect her child from danger. During the lunch recess, journalists swarmed the courthouse, trying to get comments from anyone connected to the case. Gave a brief statement. "A courageous child told the truth today. I believe justice will be served." Officer and Buddy remained sequestered in a quiet room, away from the media frenzy. Buddy seemed unbothered by the chaos. He simply rested, having expended an enormous amount of emotional energy supporting Emma through her testimony. That afternoon, the prosecution presented its case with noticeably less vigor than before. The energy had gone out of their arguments. They called a hospital administrator who about injuries, the fractured skull, the brain bleeding, but the facts fell flat against the backdrop of Emma's testimony. The jury knew now that those injuries had resulted from attacking his ex-wife and child. The prosecution's attempt to paint Sarah as an aggressor had been thoroughly undermined. As the day wore on, could feel the momentum shifting. She could see it in the way the judge looked at Sarah, in the way the jury responded to testimony. The case that had seemed so hopeless just weeks ago was now winnable. More than that, Sarah's acquittal now seemed almost inevitable. That evening, back in her cell, Sarah pressed her face against the small window, looking out at the city lights beyond the jail. She thought about Emma, about her daughter finding her voice, about Buddy's quiet presence making everything possible. For the first time in months, Sarah allowed herself to hope. Real hope, not the fragile, desperate kind, but genuine belief that justice might actually prevail. In the courtroom, the jury had seen the truth. A 3-year-old girl and a golden retriever had shattered the prosecutor's case and revealed what should have been obvious from the beginning. Sarah Mitchell was a mother protecting her child, and that was no crime. That was love. The jury deliberation room was located on the 3rd floor of the courthouse, a sterile, windowless space with institutional beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and a long wooden table surrounded by 12 chairs. The jurors filed in slowly, each carrying the weight of what they'd witnessed over the past 2 days. They didn't need lengthy discussions about the facts. They had all heard Emma's testimony. They all understood what had really happened in that shelter room. The jury foreperson, a woman named who worked as a social worker, looked around the table at her fellow jurors. "I think we all know why we're here," she said quietly. "We need to decide whether Sarah Mitchell committed assault when she pushed her husband away. Based on what we heard, based on that little girl's testimony, I believe she was defending herself and her daughter." There was no argument, no dissenting voice. The jurors engaged in the formality of discussion, reviewing the evidence presented, discussing the law as judge had instructed them. But from the first moment they entered that room, the verdict was clear. They had heard the truth from a 3-year-old child who had nothing to gain from lying, who had revealed her trauma with painful honesty, who had made the reality of the situation undeniable. They voted unanimously within the first 30 minutes, not guilty on all counts. It took 3 hours and 47 minutes before they emerged, the extra time spent primarily on procedural matters, and a single juror's need to process her own emotions about child abuse. Back in the courtroom, Sarah sat between and her sister, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had turned white. She hadn't slept in 36 hours. The stress of the trial, combined with the anxiety of waiting for the verdict, had pushed her to a state of mental and physical exhaustion. But she was present. She was conscious. She was ready to hear her fate. Emma sat in the gallery with Sarah's sister, too young to fully understand what was about to happen but sensitive enough to feel the weight of the moment. The little girl held her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Floppy, and occasionally looked toward the back of the courtroom where Officer stood with Buddy. The dog seemed to sense the importance of the moment, sitting in perfect stillness, his amber eyes alert and focused. Judge entered and took her seat. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" she asked, her voice formal and measured. The jury foreperson stood. "We have, Your Honor." The bailiff collected the verdict form from the foreperson's hands and delivered it to judge. The judge's eyes scanned the document, and for a moment, just a moment, Sarah saw something flicker across her face. Relief, satisfaction that justice had prevailed. "The defendant will please rise," judge instructed. Sarah stood on trembling legs beside her, holding her arm to keep her steady. "On the charge of assault in the 3rd degree," judge read, "how do you find the defendant?" "Not guilty," the foreperson announced, her voice clear and firm. The courtroom erupted. Unlike the earlier outburst during Emma's testimony, this was a sustained explosion of emotion, jubilation, relief, vindication. Journalists jumped to their feet. Court observers applauded. The judge didn't attempt to call for order. She simply sat back in her chair, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Sarah collapsed against, her entire body shaking with sobs, the release of months of terror, uncertainty, and despair pouring out all at once. Held her client tightly, tears streaming down her own face. She'd won. Against impossible odds, against a wealthy family with expensive lawyers, against a prosecutor determined to convict, against a legal system that often failed domestic violence victims, she'd won. Emma broke free from her aunt's grip and ran toward her mother. Sarah scooped her daughter into her arms, holding her so tightly that Emma squeaked in protest. "Mommy," the little girl asked, confused but sensing her mother's overwhelming emotion. "We're going home, baby," Sarah whispered into her daughter's hair. "We're going home. Mommy's not going to jail. We're going to be together." Officer quietly guided Buddy toward the defense table. When Emma saw the dog, she wiggled out of her mother's arms and threw herself at Buddy, wrapping her small arms around the retriever's neck. "Thank you, Buddy," she whispered. "Thank you for listening to me." Buddy stood perfectly still, allowing Emma to embrace him, his calm presence seeming to ground the moment in something larger than the legal victory, something about healing, redemption, and the power of unconditional love. Judge called for order and managed to quiet the courtroom enough to speak. "Before we conclude, I want to make a few statements for the record," she said formally. She looked directly at Sarah. "This court finds that the defendant acted in self-defense and in defense of her child. The evidence clearly demonstrates that force was used to protect against imminent harm. Therefore, the verdict of not guilty is not only appropriate but just." She then turned her attention to Mitchell, who was watching from the gallery, his face a mixture of rage and disbelief. "Furthermore, this court is issuing a temporary restraining order against the defendant's ex-husband, effective immediately. This order prohibits any contact with Sarah Mitchell or Emma Mitchell, either directly or indirectly. This restraining order will be made permanent at a hearing scheduled for next month, at which time we will address custody and visitation matters." The judge paused, her expression growing stern. "Mr. Mitchell, I am also recommending that you undergo a court-ordered anger management program as a condition of any future contact with your daughter. The evidence presented in this trial demonstrates a pattern of violence and abuse. This court takes such matters very seriously." His lawyer leaned over and whispered something urgently in his ear, but was already rising from his seat, his face dark with fury. He left the courtroom abruptly, followed by his legal team. The remainder of the courtroom proceedings were a blur of bureaucratic conclusion, final paperwork, explanations of Sarah's rights, scheduling of follow-up hearings. But none of it mattered. The verdict had been rendered. Justice had prevailed. Sarah Mitchell would walk out of the courthouse as a free woman. As they prepared to leave, pulled Sarah and Emma aside. "I want you to know," said, her voice thick with emotion, "that what happened in this courtroom today will be remembered. Emma's courage, your resilience, Buddy's incredible presence. This case is going to change how we think about trauma, about testimony, about justice. You did more than win a trial. You opened doors for other victims." Sarah hugged her attorney fiercely. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for believing in us when no one else did." Officer approached with Buddy. He shook Sarah's hand firmly. "You're free now," he said. "You and Emma can start your new life. Buddy and I will always remember the brave little girl who found her voice." Emma reached out and stroked Buddy's head one final time. "Goodbye, Buddy," she said softly. "Thank you for being my friend." The dog's tail wagged gently, as if he understood that this goodbye was necessary, that Emma had learned what she needed to learn, that she could speak, that she could be heard, that her voice mattered. As Sarah and Emma walked toward the courthouse exit, the media surged around them. But Sarah didn't stop. She didn't answer questions. She simply held her daughter's hand and walked forward toward freedom, toward their future, toward a new beginning that had been made possible by the intersection of a desperate lawyer's gamble, a traumatized child's courage, and a golden retriever's unconditional love. 6 months had passed since that extraordinary day in the courtroom when Emma's voice had shattered the silence and changed everything. Sarah Mitchell sat on the porch of her new home, a small cottage with yellow shutters and a wraparound porch, watching her daughter play in the garden. Emma was digging in the soil with a plastic shovel, her face dirt-smudged and happy, her laughter floating through the warm spring air like music. It was the kind of ordinary moment that Sarah had once taken for granted, back before the fear. Now it felt like a miracle. The house was modest. Sarah couldn't afford much on a teacher's salary, and most of her savings had gone to legal fees, but it was theirs alone. No man lived here. No rage lived here. No violence lived here. Just a mother and daughter learning how to be happy again. Emma had transformed in ways that still amazed Sarah daily. The selective mutism had completely resolved within weeks of the trial. Doctor, the child psychologist, had explained that Emma's trauma had been situational. Her voice had been silenced by terror in a specific environment. Once that environment changed, once Emma knew she was safe and her mother was free, her voice had returned naturally. Now Emma talked constantly. She sang songs. She asked endless questions. She was rediscovering what it meant to be a normal 3-year-old, instead of a frightened, silent shadow of a child. Sarah had returned to teaching at Lincoln Elementary School in the fall, and her colleagues had welcomed her back with open arms. The story had become public. There was no hiding it, and the school community had around her. Parents brought casseroles. Colleagues offered flexible schedules to accommodate Emma's therapy appointments. The principal had arranged for Emma to attend the school's after-school program, so Sarah didn't have to worry about on days when work ran late. Emma had started preschool in January, and her teachers reported that she was thriving. She made friends easily now. She participated in group activities. She was hitting all the developmental milestones that traumatized children often struggle with. The darkness that had consumed her seemed to have lifted, replaced by the natural exuberance of early childhood. But the real transformation had been internal. Sarah had changed too. The constant anxiety, the hypervigilance, the fear that had become as much a part of her as her own skin, it had begun to fade. Some nights she could now sleep without nightmares. Some mornings she woke without that crushing weight on her chest. She was beginning to remember who she had been before, and more importantly, she was discovering who she could become now. Had stayed in touch. The two women had formed a bond that transcended the typical attorney-client relationship. They'd had lunch together several times and had become something like a friend, a mentor, someone who understood the depths of Sarah's journey in ways that few people could. "Your case is being published," had told her during their last meeting. Law Review, one of the most prestigious journals in the country. They're calling it a landmark decision on courtroom accommodations for traumatized children. Judges from other states have already started citing it. Sarah had felt something between pride and discomfort at this news. She didn't want to be a symbol or a precedent. She just wanted to live her life with her daughter. But she also understood that her story, Emma's story, could help other people, other mothers, other children. If their trauma could be transformed into something that protected future victims, then some good would come from the horrors they'd endured. Officer had visited them at their new home 2 months after they'd moved in. He'd brought Buddy with him, and Emma had been so excited that she'd knocked a glass of juice off the table in her enthusiasm. The dog had patiently allowed Emma to show him around the house, to introduce him to her toys, to sit beside him in the garden while she told him about her new life. Buddy had lain in the grass, soaking up the sun, his presence a reminder that sometimes the most healing connections come from unexpected sources. "Buddy's become famous," had told Sarah with a laugh. "The courthouse gets requests from other jurisdictions asking if they can borrow him for cases. We've had to document his qualifications and training in detail so other handlers can replicate what he does. The therapy dog program has expanded because of what happened with Emma." Sarah had felt tears prick her eyes at this news. Buddy had saved her daughter's voice. And now, because of what Buddy had done, other children might find their voices too. The legal implications had been extraordinary. In the months following the trial, Sarah had learned that judges across the country were beginning to approve therapy dogs in courtrooms for child witnesses. Psychology programs had added courses about animal-assisted testimony. Universities were funding research into the intersection of trauma, animals, and communication. Emma and Buddy had opened a door that was now changing how the justice system approached traumatized children. But perhaps the most meaningful acknowledgement had come from the women's shelter on Maple Street. Director Rachel Williams had established an annual Emma's Voice Award, given to women who had demonstrated extraordinary courage in leaving abusive situations. Sarah had been the first recipient, but there would be others, women who would draw strength from knowing that another survivor had made it, that there was a path forward, that freedom was possible. Sarah had started volunteering at the shelter 2 days a week. She helped other women navigate the legal system, connected them with resources, shared her story with those who were still trapped in the darkness of abuse. She had become something of a mentor, a living example of what was possible when someone had support, legal help, and the courage to believe in a better future. Emma drew pictures constantly now, beautiful, colorful scenes filled with flowers and sunshine. And in most of them, Buddy appeared, always depicted with a halo around his head, always positioned as a protector. Emma had painted one particularly striking piece, a little girl surrounded by darkness, but holding hands with both her mother and a golden dog, with light breaking through the shadows. Sarah had framed it and hung it in the living room where she could see it every day. At night, after Emma had fallen asleep, Sarah would sometimes sit on the porch with a cup of tea and think about how far they'd come. She thought about the prison cell, the desperation, the belief that her life was over. She thought about Emma's silence and Gamble and Buddy's quiet, powerful presence. She thought about how justice had prevailed not because of legal precedent or clever arguments, but because a traumatized child had found the courage to speak truth to power, supported by an extraordinary woman lawyer and a golden retriever who seemed to understand that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply be present. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from, "Wanted you to know that the appellate court just cited your case in a major decision about victim testimony accommodations. Emma's voice is still changing the world." Sarah smiled, tears streaming down her face. She looked out at the garden where Emma slept peacefully indoors, where sunflowers were beginning to bloom, where butterflies danced in the evening air. This was her new life. This was freedom. This was everything she'd fought for. And somewhere in a quiet police facility across town, a golden retriever named Buddy rested peacefully, knowing that he'd done his job. He'd heard a silent scream and answered it with unconditional love. He'd helped a child find her voice. He'd changed the course of justice. Most importantly, he'd shown the world that healing sometimes comes from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most powerful testimony isn't delivered in words at all, but in the simple, profound act of being present with another being's pain and refusing to look away. Emma Mitchell had learned that her voice mattered. Sarah Mitchell had learned that freedom was possible, and everyone who heard their story learned that justice, real justice, sometimes requires courage, compassion, and a faithful companion who knows that the greatest gift you can give another being is your unwavering presence. The yellow cottage with the wraparound porch sat quietly in the spring evening, its lights glowing warm and welcoming. Inside were a mother and daughter who had survived the unthinkable. Outside, the world continued to turn, changed forever by their story of survival, resilience, and the transformative power of being heard.